Good evening. Good to see a few of you, and at least to see some of your names. I know you're there, even if I can't see your pretty faces. We'll wait just another moment, and then we'll get started. There are a few people coming in person here. Hey, Adam. Yeah. Here, you can take a source sheet here.
Thank you.
Did you get to go to Sarachek?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It looked like a good time.
Yeah.
Which game did you go to? Okay. Did you see the early morning game or no, they played MTA on Sunday, right?
Right.
And they lost to MTA. Okay, so you saw that game. Okay. Yeah, it's a good energy in that building, huh? It's a lot of fun.
They won against Eula
Yeah.
Monday
was-
morning.
Yeah, I saw you, Barry, there. You were sitting right behind the bench with Dina. So I saw you, I think it was at the MTA game.
Right.
Josh had a
Right.
pretty good, he played pretty well. I was debriefing with him this morning.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
Monday, 21 points, even better.
Yeah, well, definitely beating Eula was sweet for Coach Gelb because he coached them for a bunch of years. So a little bit of full circle there. Well, it was a good time, and it brought me back to my high school years. So it was sweet to see. We almost always lose the first game at Sarachek, and then win the second
Mhm.
game. Get all hopeful that we're going to be the tier 3 champions, and then we lose that. Then we win the final game.
That's what happened.
Yeah, that happened to me twice in my high school experience. So it was very reminiscent of that pattern. Okay. Okay, it's wonderful to see lots of people online. I'm going to post the source sheet in the chat and also share screen as we try to do this in hybrid mode. Okay, hopefully you can see the source sheet in the chat and you can open it up. Okay. Okay, let's get started here. So Dayenu is always a highlight of the Seder experience. So when I began to think about how I wanted to continue the theme of our year of studying Piyutim, of the songs of Shabbat and some of the songs of Purim, it was an easy first choice to land on Dayenu. Everyone looks forward to that moment of Dayenu. And why? What's the reason for that excitement? Singing. Okay, great. So after a long drawn out Magid where there are not many tunes and there's a lot of mumbling and griping and beautiful Divrei Torah as well, a new modality is welcomed. So the catchy tune after a lot of reading and talking definitely grabs everyone's attention. And I would also wager to say that once we get to Dayenu, some of the grumbling stomachs also get excited that we are finally coming close to the meal. So we have a tradition here of beginning our study of the various piyutim by going through some of the tunes. So when it came to the Shabbat songs, we sometimes got up to 5 or 6 different varieties from Sephardi and Ashkenazi and even some Temani Minhagim. With Dayenu, I'm really just familiar with the classic tune of Dayenu, 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 na 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 na. And I'm curious if there are others out there. Don't be bashful. Okay. Hey, Miriam. Oh, you just missed my singing performance. I don't know if you could hear, but I was just singing the classic Dayenu tune. But here, welcome, Dan. Welcome, Miriam. We got a nice crew online as well. But I prefer the in-person because the exchange of facial expressions in person brings me to life. So we were just going through our classic exercise of trying to come up with various tunes for the songs that we're going to study together. And with Dayenu, I think it's a pretty short list. I think the Maccabees did a mashup of Dayenu where they put it to all sorts of funny classic tunes. So if my kids were here, they could probably add 3 or 4 more. Yeah, there is more than one. I don't know if it goes beyond the first verse to the whole thing, but I'm trying to think of. Oh, there's one that they do. It's not coming to me, but they do Dayenu. Oh, it's a more of a dramatic kind of Dayenu, and they do like heavy metal, like Dayenu. It's a very abrupt transition there. So, the a cappella groups have had some fun with the different Dayenu tunes, but I am only familiar with one that lasts through all the verses. Anyone else have another one to add out there? Okay. Well, uh-huh. Okay. Uh-huh. So it's like a sing-song kind of chant.
But it's more more less the statement.
Okay. Yeah, we also have a family kind of sing-song that we use to get through quickly different parts of the Haggadah. But we don't use that for Dayenu because we use the classic melody. Okay. So a little bit about the history and the structure of Dayenu before we move to deciphering the particular meaning of each of the stanzas. So the origin is unknown and the author is also unknown. It is not in the Rambam's Haggadah, and it is not in the Haggadah of Rav Sadia Gaon. Both of those serve as sort of the templates for our modern Haggadot. The earliest time that it appears is in the son of the Rambams, Rabbi Avraham ben Harambam, in the 13th century. It appears in his Haggadah. But in that Haggadah, it seems to be not placed at the end of Magid, but as one of the songs that's sung when everyone is a little bit drunk at the end of the Seder, that we nowadays call Nirtza. So it migrated from there to this place in Magid as a little bit of a crescendo for Magid. And the question is why? And hopefully we'll answer sort of the appropriateness of this song as the climax of the Magid experience as we go through the sort of meaning of Dayenu itself. Just a little bit about the structure. The structure is similar to Mizmor Kuf Lamed Vav, which you don't have in front of you, but it's the Kilei Olam Chasto, which we actually do say in the Seder. And this is, we say, in our family, we do L'makeh Mitzrayim Bifkarem Kilei Olam Chasto, that's sort of the sing song that we use to get through the Haggadah. So that is a similar structure in that it lists a particular event, right? Biyad chazaka ubzroa netuya ki leolam chasto. And then it says, right, and by that God took us out with a strong arm and with an outstretched hand, with a strong hand and outstretched arm, and then forever is God's goodness. Okay, so that list of events followed by praise of God and gratitude of God sort of serves as a structure for a precedent or a template for Dayenu, because Dayenu also lists a event and then it says Dayenu afterwards. But as we're going to see, that structure flowing from Mizmor Kuf Lamed Vav is actually inverted and is the opposite in the way that I want to try to read Dayenu. One other structural point is that how many verses are there to Dayenu? 15. Okay, so you can look on the sheet here, turn it over. There are 15. Why is that number significant? What? Good. So Miriam shared that there are 15 steps leading up to the Beit HaMikdash, where the Leviim would sing the Shir Shel Yom. And corresponding to those 15 steps, there are 15 songs within Tehillim that begin Shir HaMa'alot, right? The song of the steps. So when we sing Shir HaMa'alot B'shuv, right? All the time that we sing that at a meal, that's one of the 15 songs that the Leviim would sing on the steps leading up to the Beit HaMikdash. So the 15 has significance there as a number that is often used when building songs. There's also significance to 15 and how many steps are there in the Seder? Okay, good, 15. Was that always the case when we sing Kadesh, Kadesh, Urchatz, Karpat, Yachatz? So most of the Rishonim say that there are 14 steps to the Seder. They're corresponding to the Yad, to Yud Dalet. So where does the 15 come in? The last step of the Seder, Nirtza, was added at a much later stage. It's not in most of the Haggadot until 15th century. But you'll have to stay tuned for that, because that's going to be the third part of this series on the songs of the Seder, of the history and the significance of Nirtza, and why and when that came to be. That's going to be on Shabbat Hagadol, on Shabbos afternoon, the Shabbos before Pesach. So that's just a little bit about the structure, sort of the template of from Tehillim, and then the reason why it has 15. So now getting to a little bit of the content. The most discussions around Dayenu center around the analysis of individual lines, and that leads us to focus on what is instead of what isn't, right? That we should focus on the fact that God gave us the Torah, right? Even if he wasn't going to bring us into Eretz Yisrael. Another sort of classic question that's asked is, would it really have been enough if God gave us the Torah but didn't bring us into Israel, right? We're sort of saying that or singing that, but would that have been sufficient? We seem to say it would have been, but that's implying a lot, because the Torah not being able to manifest outside the land of Israel would have been insufficient to live a life outside of Eretz Yisrael. So the approach that we're going to take this evening is very different, because we're going to look at this piyut as a whole, and see that each line is an example of something that our ancestors took for granted and that we can rectify by being thankful for. So I should give credit to where credit is due. There was a professor of Jewish studies, Rabbi Nachman Cohen, who wrote about Dayenu the following. You can see this quote on the top left of the source sheet. He says that the items mentioned in Dayenu were chosen because the Jews of that generation scoffed at these godsends. Dayenu is therefore a tikkun, a rectification for the ingratitude of our ancestors. So this is the thesis that he suggests, and the project that I want to try to lead us through is actually trying to find examples in Tanakh where we see the ingratitude of Bnei Israel for all of the 15 events that Dayenu lists.
But when you say that generation, what are you talking about?
The generation that experienced the miracle that is ungrateful for that miracle. And so in some ways, it really is the inverse of the Kilei Olam Chasto Mizmor Tehillim, because in that they're saying, Biyad Chazaka Bezron Atiyah Kilei Olam Chasto. God took us out, and then that generation is praising him for taking us out with an outstretched arm. But here we're going to see that each of the items that is listed as being enough, if God had just done this for us, that would have been sufficient. But how are those items chosen? So the thesis, the hypothesis is that the generation living through that miracle did not appreciate that miracle. And so all these years later, we are meant to try and appreciate that in retrospect as a little bit of a fix for what our ancestors were not grateful for. Okay, so is that thesis sort of clear? Okay, so let's drive ahead and see if this checks out. I want to apologize in advance that when I printed out these source sheets this morning, some of the formatting got a little bit weird. So some of the Hebrew is a little out of order, and there's some funny spaces here, but we'll figure it out together. Okay, so let's go from the beginning. The intro to Dayenu is Kama Ma'alot Tavot Lamakom Aleinu, which means, right, how many favors or degrees did Hashem place before us, right? So we see already that the frame for this exercise is about all the good things that God did for us. right? Kama ma'alot, just how many? There's just endless amount of good things that God did for us, and here we're about to list them. So we can already see from the onset that the frame is one of gratitude and appreciation. So sometimes we focus in Dayenu as, oh, this would have been enough, just this without that. But a different way to look at it is through this thesis that Dr. Cohen asserts, which is these are all ways in which we are redeeming our ancestors in gratitude. So let's look at these examples one by one. Any comments or questions from our online group? Okay. Can everyone hear me online? Yeah, okay. I think when there are some comments going back and forth for the in-person, it's harder to hear. So I'll try to repeat the comments that come in live. We don't have the advanced technology yet that the computer turns automatically when there are, or the adapter sort of picks up sounds from elsewhere. Okay, so verse number 1. Ilu hotzianu mitzrayim, right? And then the continuation of that is velo asa bahem shefatim, right? So if God had just brought us out of Egypt, but had not sort of meted out judgment against the Egyptians, that would have been enough. Dayenu, it would have been sufficient. So what is the counterpart to that? So in the first parak in Devarim, the curtain opens and Moshe is sharing a monologue with the Jewish people, which is a veiled rebuke. He goes through all of his life and all of the years in the desert. This is Moshe's last hurrah before he says goodbye, and he does sort of a summary of all of the experiences with a sort of critical eye towards the people for their shortcomings. So he had just criticized them for I think it was for the sin of the spies. And then in verse Chaf Zayin, he says as follows. We're on the in the chart here, in the number 1 all the way on the right. Vateragnu ve'elohechem vatomru. So vateragnu really means like you slandered your God and you said in your tents, right, later in private, Bisinat Hashem otanu hotzianu mi'eretz Mitzrayim. Why did God take us out of Egypt? Because he hated us, right? Why did he do this for us? To punish us. Why did he do this? So that we would suffer. How would we suffer? Latet otanu biyad ha'emari lahashmi denu. That he would hand us over to the giants, to the people who are living in the land of Canaan. This is what the spies and that generation felt, right? So they were upset at God for taking them out of Egypt, right? And this was the generation that left Egypt. This was just years after the Exodus, and here they are. Moshe is reporting to us that what he heard in their tents was murmurings of people saying, God took us out for the wrong reasons. He took us out just to spite us. And can you imagine the right, that kind of rejection of the wondrous experience of Mitzrayim? It seems outlandish, but nevertheless, this is something that Moshe is saying happened, that the Jewish people ascribed hatred towards God, or from God towards them, in the act of taking them out of Egypt, because he was going to leave them to be destroyed by enemies. Okay, so when we are saying Ilu Hotzianu Mitzrayim, we are appreciating Yetziat Mitzrayim in a way that our ancestors did not. Okay, so the first one checks out. And I should invite other examples because these are some of the ones that I came up with, but I know sitting around this table and in Zoom land, there are lots of people that know a lot of stuff. And so if you can think of other instances in which ingratitude is displayed for these things, please allow us to benefit from your suggestion. Okay, so moving on to number 2, right? Ilu asa behem shefatim, velo asa be'elohehem, right? Even if you had meted out judgment against the Egyptians, but spared, their gods, that would have been enough. So where do we see that the Jews were ungrateful for the way that Hashem took revenge on the Egyptians? So in Tehillim, in Mizmor Kuf Vav, we see a whole long list of things that the Jewish people were ungrateful for in the generation of leaving Egypt. And so we're going to come back to that Mizmor several times. And here is the first instance of that, where we read, here we're all the way on the right side in box 2, Chatanu im avotenu. So they say that we have sinned like our forefathers, ha'avinu v'hirshanu, right? We have done wrong and gone astray. And here the Hebrew is a little bit off. Read actually from the left side here where it says, avotenu b'mitzrayim, our forefathers in Egypt, and then go back to the beginning of the line, lo hiskilu niflotecha, they did not appreciate, the English here, did not perceive your wonders, the lo zachru et rov, and they did not remember most, rov chastecha, the majority of your kindnesses, vayimaru al yam, vayamru al yam b'yam suf, and they rebelled at the Sea of Reeds. So what do we see in this source? This is David talking about his generation, that his generation was saying that they sinned together with their forefathers, in that just like their forefathers did not appreciate the miracles of Mitzrayim and did not appreciate the majority of kindnesses of God in bringing them out of Egypt, so too they failed to recognize them. And Vayimaru al yam b'yam suf, that they rebelled against God at the Yam Suf. So when do the Jews rebel against God at Yam Suf? What's the scene where the Jewish people are lacking in faith? I'm sorry. So when they are surrounded by the Egyptians on one side and water on the other, they sort of throw their hands up to God and say, "You trapped us here. We're doomed," right? But how does that relate to this verse from Dayenu of Asabahem Shefatim, of judging and meting out vengeance upon the Egyptians? So the way that Rashi understands Vayimaru al yam b'yam suf is after the Jewish people have already crossed the sea. They don't believe that the Egyptians are actually going to be killed. They think that the Egyptians are going to come and capture them. Even as the sea is coming crashing down upon their enemies, they still are doubtful about whether God is actually going to prevent the Egyptians from capturing the Jewish people and bringing them back to Egypt. That's the rebellion, which connects back more specifically to that we didn't appreciate that while God was in the middle of meting out judgment against their enemies, even then the Jewish people didn't appreciate, they doubted God. So that's an example of the ingratitude, for the way that the Egyptians were punished for persecuting the Jews. We're going to skip number 3 because the wrong pasuk got copied there. So we'll just have to skip that for now, and we'll come back maybe later. But let's go to number 4. So number 4 is ilu haraget bechorehem, even if God had killed all the firstborns, v'lo natan mamonam dayenu. This is a good verse for us in our household because it's the first time that the word Natan is mentioned, which gets my son all psyched up. Okay, so if God had just killed their firstborn, that would have, and spared, an implication, and spared the Jewish firstborn, that would have been enough. So where do we see in Tanakh that the Jews are ungrateful for the firstborn being spared? We see that the firstborn were originally expected to carry the mantle of leadership in the Mishkan, but they are replaced. Who are they replaced by? The Levim. Why are they placed by the Levim? What did the Bechor do? So it's unclear from the text what they did, but the Mefarshim fill in the blanks and say that the Bechors actually took the lead in the Chet HaEgel. They were the rabble-rousers. They were the ones that said, here's a bag, let's fill it up with jewelry so that we can make a golden cow. Got a comment here. Oh yeah, please scroll up for us. Okay. There we go. So we see this replacement of the Bechor in the 3rd chapter of Bamidbar. So here we're in the 4th box. Ve'ani hine lakachti et haleviim mitoch bnei Yisrael. I have taken the Levites tachat kol Bechor to replace the firstborns. Peter rechem bnei Yisrael v'hayu li haleviim, and all of the first birth, the first issue of the womb among the Jewish people. Those were the ones that had been consecrated to me, but instead the Levim will replace them. Because God sort of gained some sort of jurisdiction over the firstborns by dint of saving them and sparing them from Makat Bechorot. And so they sort of owed God for their lives, and they would be able to pay off that debt by serving the Beit HaMikdash, but they lost the privilege to do that because they became unworthy by leading the charge of the sin of the golden calf. Okay, so we see that from here that they were, again, the firstborns were ungrateful for being spared. Okay, moving right along to, he brings a few. This one is the one that I brought. He brought the, I should have given him more credit. The first one he brought, and the second one he brought. The third one is a mistake. I had meant to replace it. The fourth one I found, and I think the fifth one is his. So he brings several examples, and I tried to fill in some of the ones that he didn't have. Okay, so number 5 is ilu natan lanu et mamonam. Right, if there was a transfer of wealth at the dawn of Jewish history, when the Jews were invited to go find where the Egyptians stored their jewelry during Makat Choshech, and then to demand that as payment before they left. So ilu natan lanu et mamonam, if they had given, if God had facilitated the transfer of wealth, right, that would have been enough, even if he didn't split the sea. So where do we see that the Jews are ungrateful for the wealth that God gave them? So, of course, what do they use that gold for? The golden calf, right? But that is a sort of something that is mentioned again and again, and there is a specific kind of reference to it in Hosea. Anyone remember what the beginning of Sefer Hosea is? What Hashem tells Hosea to do? He tells him to go find a wife have kids with a wife, and then divorce the wife and send the wife away. And it's meant to serve as a metaphor for how God feels as the Jewish people have rejected him and gone astray from him. It's a very difficult kind of activity that the prophet of Hosea has to sort of live out. And within that sort of metaphor, Hashem in the second parak of Hosea explains sort of how humans can sort of commiserate with God for the kind of treachery that they have performed against God. It can also be experienced in a sort of human interpersonal way as well. So here in Perek Bet Pasuk Yud, we see Vihi lo yada ki anochi natati la. Right, this is talking about the wife of Hosea. She didn't even know all the things that I gave her: hadagan v'hatirosh v'hitzar, the grain and the wine and the oil. V'kesef hirbetila v'zahav asula baal. And I gave her all sorts of silver and gold. And what did she do with those? She made idols. I was so generous to her, and she used all of those resources to rebel against me. Okay, this is God telling Hosea that you should experience an ounce of what I feel like when I give goodness to the Jewish people, and then they use it against me. Just like your wife is going to do with the gifts that you give her. Okay, so that's an instance in which we see this pattern of the Jewish people being materially well off and using it for idolatrous practices. Okay, so in verse 6, Ilu karalanu et hayam, I sort of thought we could just refer back to the Mizmor that we mentioned in number 2, that the Jewish people did not perceive the miracles of the coming out of Egypt, which includes, right, the Vayimaru al Yam Suf b'Yam Suf, right, the split, the sea had just split, and then they turn around and don't even appreciate it. And I thought we could sort of take that for the next 2 verses as well. Ilu ha'avinu betocha b'charva. If we turn, I gotta scroll here. Okay, the next 3 verses, 6 through 8, all relate to the experience of Kriyat Yam Suf and are all sort of rebuffed by the Jewish people rebelling and showing ingratitude to that salvation. Okay, so moving on to verse 9. Ilu sipek tzarchenu b'midbar arba'im shana. God, if you had just provided us with the provisions for the 40 years in the desert, that would have been enough. But we see that the Jewish people did not appreciate the provisions that they had in the desert. Right? They complain many times about the water being bitter, about the food being tasteless. Right? So we're familiar with those complaints. And Rabbi Cohen here brings another instance in which David HaMelech describes the ingratitude of the Jewish people during their traversing the desert. This is in box number 9, all the way on the right side. We'll just read the English here for the sake of time. Right? Can God spread a feast in the wilderness? So he commanded the skies above. He opened the doors of heaven and rained manna upon them for food. So giving them heavenly grain, each man ate a hero's meal. He sent them provision in plenty. Nonetheless, they went on sinning and had no faith in his wonders. So the provisions in the desert were not just food, but they were protected from the elements by the Ananei HaKavod, right? The way that the heaven, you open the doors of the heaven and commanded the skies in such a way that when it was hot, the clouds protected them from the sun. And so when it was windy, the clouds shielded them from the wind. But that was not appreciated by the Jewish people as they went on to sin and didn't have faith that God was really the one that was in charge. Okay, moving on to number 10. Ilu ha'achlinu et haman. So we're familiar with many instances in which the Jewish people complain about the man. So it just chose one of those in source 10. And the people spoke against God and against Moshe. Why did you make us leave Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no bread and no water, and we have come to loathe this miserable food. Right? So how do they describe this food raining down from Shamayim that, kids believe could taste like anything you want it to taste like? They call it lechem hakokel, disgusting, right? Food. They don't appreciate that they don't even have to work for their food. They are not grateful for the existence of the man. And continuing in 11, right, we say, God, if you had given us the Shabbat, that would have been enough. When is it that the Jewish people are not grateful for the Shabbat? Right after God tells them, listen, on Shabbat, I'm going to take care of you. Just gather 2 days worth of man, and that will last you through Shabbat. And what happens? What do the people do on Saturday morning? They jump out of bed and they go to look for man. Right? They don't trust they don't trust that God would actually come through and that he would provide what he told them he would. And so we see them that they don't appreciate the Shabbat because they reject the Shabbat. Moving right along, if he had brought us to Har Sinai, right? Even if we had just come to Har Sinai, that would have been enough. But we see in Tehillim, again, this is in Mizmor Kuf Vav, where we see a list of, everything okay?
Yeah, we just wanted to know if you want some leftovers.
We're going to be done in like 5 minutes, so maybe, okay? So for those of you who are listening online, the Benot Sheirut, who have a Chug Bishul, offered us the leftovers. So maybe that'll incentivize you to come next week in person, because the building smells really good right now. They made some sort of Israeli meat dish tonight. So hopefully we'll be able to partake in a few. Okay. So we were just describing how they came to Har Sinai, but they, at Har Sinai itself, they didn't appreciate what was going on, and they were rebellious even on the morning of Matan Torah. We know that they overslept and their alarm clocks didn't work, and which is, one of the reasons we stay up for all night on Shavuot. So there we see a behavior which demonstrates ingratitude for Har Sinai. And giving us the Torah, we get the 10 commandments. The first two are Mipi Hashem. They come directly from Hashem, and the rest come through Moshe. And then Moshe goes up to get the rest of the 603 commandments, roughly speaking, from Hashem. And what happens when they seem to calculate that he's a day off? Vayar ha'am ki boshesh Moshe, here in box 13. They replace God. Right? This is like, right, this compared to a bride and groom who are unfaithful on their wedding night. They just were under the chuppah a few minutes ago, and then hours later, they're already breaking their fidelity. So too, with the Chet HaEgel, it was just minutes after receiving the Torah, they're already replacing, wanting a new God. Okay, and in verse 14, Ilu hechnisanu Eretz Yisrael, if you had just brought it into Eretz Yisrael and not even built us the Beit HaMikdash, then dayenu. And so there I suggested the episode of the spies, in which the Jewish people accept the lashon hara, the evil speech of the spies, when they say that it's an eretz ochad yoshbehahi, that this is the kind of place that devours its inhabitants. it's not a good place for us to live because it will consume us. And therefore we should stay out of the land of Israel. So the fact that the spies could say that and that the entire nation could believe it shows that they didn't appreciate the land of Israel was their destiny. And then lastly, I didn't bring an example of this, but building the Beit HaMikdash, we know throughout the Nevi'im, certainly the Nevi'im Achronim, that the Jewish people did not appreciate having the Beit HaMikdash, and the way that they rebelled against it, they built many bamot, sort of regional temporary altars, and stopped coming to do pilgrimage to Yerushalayim, indicating that they didn't appreciate having a centralized place of worship with which to commune with Hashem. So these are sort of 15 examples that prove, or at least come close to demonstrating the veracity of this thesis. And I'm curious to hear any feedback or pushback before I conclude with one last thought. Is this a new approach that we hadn't thought of before? I think it's pretty innovative, and definitely a way to look at the entire piyut in sort of through a new lens. Let me stop sharing here. Okay. So Dan is asking if there are other examples in the Haggadah where the Jewish people are chastised for not doing the right thing. Okay, so the wicked child is sort of punched in the teeth for having sort of the audacity to push the Seder leader and sort of ask a rude question. Yeah, there's definitely, he says, "Ma ha'avodah hazot lachem," right? The what is this to you, right? Meaning the wicked son, it doesn't appreciate that this was beneficial to him, right? He excludes himself from it, which is a classic symptom of ingratitude. Yeah, so I think the placement of Dayenu at the end of Magid is essentially almost as a prelude to Hallel, right? Hallel is a much more explicit way of saying thank you to God, but Dayenu is it's a little bit of a sort of backdoor way of saying thank you to God. And it's saying all the things that we just described you doing to us, we really do appreciate, even today, right? And that's why we're reliving it year after year, so that we can continue to build that feeling of appreciation for those things that happened to our ancestors. And how do we do that? We feel the same feelings that our ancestors felt by re-experiencing the redemption year after year. So I thought that really the task that Dayenu is inviting us to consider is to try and appreciate the things that we have not sufficiently appreciated in the past. Things that we took for granted, right? That's essentially the tikkun that the Dayenu is pushing us to make. And I wanted to reference a fantastic article. It's even a book that probably several of you are familiar with, by A.J. Jacobs. He first wrote an essay about making a cup of coffee, that it takes more than a village. Are any of you familiar with this experiment? It's a fantastic experiment where a journalist was dared by his son to thank every person that had any role at all in the production of his morning cup of coffee. And he takes a few years and thanks tens of thousands of people. And he writes a book about it, right? And he thinks, and he goes back to the place where the beans were grown, and the people who made the machinery to harvest the beans, and the roads that were used to transport the beans, from place A to place B, and the politicians who passed the legislation to make the roads something that was, done through tax dollars, right? And it's sort of ad infinitum that he, tries to personally thank everyone who even had the smallest role in making his cup of coffee a reality. Some people just thank the barista, right? And that's enough, but it's something that he took for granted for his whole life. He was a huge coffee drinker, and that steaming cup every morning gets him going. And he never really appreciated all of the different steps that led up to it. All right. So I think that activity is very much in keeping with what Dayenu is inviting us to do, to saying, what are the things in our lives that we just assume and we take take them for granted without really examining them step by step, right? Being thankful for general things is not really enough. Part of what makes gratitude meaningful is its specificity. That's what Dayenu does. It breaks down all the different stages of the redemption to say we really are grateful for all these various different stages, right? Maybe our ancestors, maybe even last year we weren't grateful enough for them, but we're going to try to redeem ourselves by being grateful for them right now. So I invite you to consider at your Seder table sort of challenging each other to try and appreciate new things that you had always benefited from, but not always appreciated. And with that, I'll invite any comments or questions. And if not, then for those who are here, B'tei Avon. His name is A.J. Jacobs. This is he wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about his activity. It's a great read, and he's a really colorful character. He did a TED Talk on it as well, of course. And then he wrote a book. Yeah, that's the article. You can keep that if you want. Yeah, you can have that. Yeah. So it's a great. Oh, great. Awesome. Okay. Laila Tov to everyone online. Thanks for joining. And next week we're going to be doing Chad Gadya, animal noises required. Okay. Okay. Laila Tov l'kulam.